Okay, I think we'll just start, and anyone who's late can join us late. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Danny Finkelstein, to sultry Scotland, where we're having a Mediterranean summer so far. I should say that it's only when the weather's like this that I feel the pull of Scottish independence, because we're all suddenly very cosmopolitan and living our best life, and then it starts raining again, and I quickly come to my senses. But my name's Chris Deerin, I'm Director of Reformed Scotland, and welcome to our latest event, which I'm delighted to say has as its guest Daniel Finkelstein, who you will all know, celebrated journalist and commentator, member of the House of Lords, influential Conservative thinker, and also a member of the Chelsea board. And Danny, I feel it would be remiss while I've got you here as a passionate Man United fan of 40 years standing, not to ask you if you could rush through the Mason Mount signing, because we have a habit of buying players 5 minutes before the new season starts. So if you could just give us a bit of money off and get us rolling, that would be much appreciated.
That's out the question.
We'll go up to 55, is that? So we're here to talk about this fantastic new book, which I just finished, sitting on my back step this morning in the sunshine. And I'll say this genuinely, I haven't read a book that I both enjoyed and that shattered me quite as much as this book did in a long time. I'm a bit of a roughy-tufty Scotsman, but it managed to reduce me to tears on a couple of occasions. It also made me laugh. It made me think very, very hard. I'm pleased to say it looks like being a bestseller. It's the extraordinary story of Danny's family's experiences in the build-up to the Second World War, during the war itself, and then in the aftermath. So I think Danny's family, the German and Polish wings, experienced the full gamut of evil and misery inflicted both by Hitler's Nazis and Stalin's Soviets, which is an important point that we'll come to in the discussion. And much of the book's power comes from the personal stories of his father Ludwig and his mother Miriam, their own parents and their wider families, where the personal so dramatically illustrates the political and the larger picture. I was saying to Danny before we came on that I read mostly fiction, and what I don't like when I read non-fiction are these big war books that are full of this amount of tanks and this amount of aircraft and this production of steel and the rest of it. The numbers are just so big and I get bored quite quickly. And so this book really, really worked for me because it's told through human beings, but the story amounts to really a fascinating history of the Second World War as it affected probably its greatest victims. Though the book, I guess, is in part a story of tragedy, it contains many other things too. As I said, it's very funny, certainly at the start, before things get too dark. It tells of resilience, survival, and I think very importantly, hope as well. It's the story of heroes as well as victims, ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the most hellish of circumstances. And at the heart of it all, and this comes through, I think, in every sentence of Danny's writing, it's a story of love. Parents' love for their children and children's love for their parents, the bond between sisters and other siblings, the reliance on and support from extended families. And it's, beyond that even, it raises important questions that we should be thinking about how the Allies, including Britain, treated Jewish refugees throughout the war. And about why, to this day, the evils of Stalinism are not accorded the same notoriety and scrutiny as those of Nazism when they had so very much in common. It's beautifully written, of course. I should say I've been a huge fan of Danny's columns for a long time, like many of the rest of you. I guess a real inspiration, clarity of thought, conviction, and always very entertaining. It's also a page-turner that I find is structured almost like a thriller, if that's not a crass thing to say. It goes between his mum's story and his dad's story, or his mum's family story and his dad's family story, from chapter to chapter, and often leaves you hanging on a moment where something dramatic's happening. So it's a real page turner as you're going through it. You're desperate to get back to what you've just left in the chapter after the next one. So for those of you who have yet to pick up a copy, I really can't recommend it highly enough. Delighted to have Danny with us today. We'll have a bit of a chat. Very keen to take your questions, so please do send them through using the chat button on Zoom, and we'll try to get through the best of them. So welcome to you, Danny. Thank you for joining us.
That was immensely generous of you, and I sound completely fascinating. I can't wait to hear myself.
Don't let us down, Danny, please. I guess we'll start maybe just by asking you about the writing this book. I mean, it's kind of obvious why you decided to do it when you read the story, but maybe you could talk us through when and why you decided, and the process of research, because there's so much personal family detail in here. I mean, I couldn't write anything about my family like this because I think beyond my grandparents, I have no idea who we are particularly. But you have this resource that you've obviously been able to dig into.
So I suppose two things. I've always sort of known from a very young age that this was a book that had to be written and that I would have to write it. Even when I wasn't a writer and even much of a reader, I knew that. I had a sort of funny, I remember my grandmother having a kind of pot that she had used obviously in Iran and some of the places where they'd been exiled, a sort of battered pot, and it was under the stairs, and I thought, oh, I could start with that. I didn't, but I could have done. And I remember thinking that, and I must have been about sort of 12 when I came up with that idea. So even at that time, I was sort of playing around with the book in my head. But I turned to it for a number of reasons. One, to be quite honest, I had the time to do it. But also I felt politically the moment to tell their stories had arrived, that there was a kind of danger of a rise of populism and anti-pluralism, a turn away from the rule of law, questioning of a kind of, liberal capitalist democracy, and all of it needed my grandparents' and parents' story in order to kind of offset that. So that was a little bit the reason why I did it. I have to say, if you are going to tell the story of your family, it does help if one of your grandparents is one of the greatest archivists of the 20th century, because then they really do have a lot of documents. So that you understand that comment, my grandfather, Alfred Weiner, came back from the war in 1919, having fought on the front, nearly died as a German soldier. He comes back and he realizes that that there is a lot of anti-Semitic. Can you all hear me, by the way, everybody?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry, because I all froze for a second. And he comes back from the war, and he realizes there's a rise of anti-Semitism. He begins to warn against it. One of his main tools in doing that is collecting together information. So he begins in the 1920s to collect everything that the Nazis, which he realizes are the main force, do or say. Every newspaper they issue, every leaflet. He turns out basically a couple of decades later to be the only person who had a photograph of Joseph Mengele. He is the only person who has all the speeches of Rudolf Hess. He has this archive. Initially, what happens is that when the Nazis actually come to power, despite he's been going around the country using his archive to try to persuade people how dangerous they are, they come to power anyway, and Goering calls him to a meeting. The meeting is at first perfectly reasonable, and at the end of it, he says to him, I know you have this archive and you have to destroy it. And then a second meeting with the Jewish community follows, where it's obvious that that is a threat, and he realizes he's going to have to destroy this archive. So, or at least they chase the archive around the country, and then he destroys it. He goes to Amsterdam, gets out of Germany, and starts again there. But the result of it was, over the period where he was in Amsterdam, the largest collection in the world of material, and it was used then in the Nuremberg trials, or it was indispensable to the prosecution, and in the Eichmann trials. And I did have that archive, including all of his correspondence, including crucially the personal testimony of their amazing home help Betty, and all of this to help me write the book. But the other piece of good fortune is that my father's story, much less well known, much less well catalogued. The Soviets are much more in denial about what they did. So you don't have, as you know, one of the things I do in the book is follow everybody who was in my mother's and aunt's little children's club, and I follow what happened to each of them in the club. And I'm able to track down 19 of them. If you did the same in the Soviet Union, you wouldn't be able to track down anybody. I've been to lots of places in this book to research it. I did not go to Ukhta, where my grandfather was in the Gulag, because there's nothing there, and we don't admit it was there. So there's no point. I have, apart from the fact that it's now quite dangerous as well. So, but my grandmother had kept a lot of correspondence, and my father gave a 4-hour testimony to the Association of Jewish Refugees. And that, together with some of the literature on that period, and talking to one or two other people who come into the story who also had some records, enabled me to tell his story as well as my mother's.
Yeah, and I think Alfred obviously is one of the central characters of the book, and an extraordinary and unusual man, I think, in some ways. Very dogged, almost obsessive in what he was doing, prescient clearly in seeing the Nazi threat coming a bit earlier than most did. And I guess some of what comes over is that he did sacrifice some of his family life to pursue that, because he could see the danger, which was obviously gigantic, as it would prove.
He absolutely did. So, you know, a lot of the time, the main memory the girls have of their dad is that he wasn't there. And, you know, one of the most extraordinary things is they come back out of Belsen. He manages to get them to the United States. I don't want to ruin too much of the book, but, you know, but when he sees them, he immediately goes back to London and they're in the United States, and don't see him for another 2 years. And he did that for very reasonable professional reasons. He thought the archive without him, which he probably was right about, would collapse. He wouldn't be able to get any money. He would be without an income, and his life's work would be destroyed. He did see that, and as a you know, now I think this country has every reason to be incredibly grateful he did that, because the library is still there in Russell Square, and it's an amazing archive for historians, a really important one. But it is a pretty extraordinary thing to have done, even despite that. So he clearly, you know, he spends several years in the middle of the story in the prosecution of the publishers of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and is in the famous Byrne trial. He's responsible, or one of the people responsible, for showing that the protocols were a fake. And but again, you know, that meant him spending a lot of time in Switzerland when his family was in Holland.
Mm-hmm. And your other grandfather, your father's father, Dolu, he's another central figure, and I suppose, you know, he was a very successful businessman before the war, and lost it all, as many Jews did. And I was just going to say that the book, certainly that part of it, and others, reminded me quite a bit of The World of Yesterday, the Stefan Zweig book, because when it, you know, you had the before, and then you had the during, and then you had the after, when it, you know, everything was lost in a sense. Belongings, people, culture, geography, identity, it all gone, and people had to start again, in effect, both in terms of their income, but also their lives and the people they knew.
Completely, and it look, this was a deliberate Soviet policy, right? They were trying to eradicate, and did succeed actually in eradicating the political elite of Poland. When my grandfather is arrested, the interrogators are accusing him of strengthening the might of capitalist Poland, which he absolutely did do. He's found guilty of being an antisocial element. That's what he's sent to the Gulag to do. His nickname before the war was the Iron King. Right, that's how wealthy he was, and I've been to see his house, and it's extraordinary. Even now, they built this beautiful house with this wonderful Art Deco interior, and it's still the person who's bought it is a very wealthy person who's bought it now, and he was keen for me to come see it because I knew how it used to be, and he's trying to restore it in all respects, because my grandparents' Art Deco was so ahead of its time that he found it. Would he like to live in that now? Right. So he had an extraordinary, and they tried to destroy that, but there's an interesting thing, so the theory they had was they took everything away from him: his house, his home, you know, his family. He's expelled across the world. He never can go back. He ends up in a small house off the Hendon Way near Brent Cross Shopping Centre. And despite that, his grandchildren, one of them is a member of the House of Lords. My brother is a knight who was the head of the chief scientific advisor for national security, Sir Anthony, and my sister is a permanent secretary of DEFRA. In other words, in one generation, it failed completely. And that is pretty interesting in itself. But it's a bit too self-serving a point to actually make in the book. But as we're among friends, I felt I could say it. I think it's very interesting that happened. So. Yeah, the attempt to destroy Dolu's life, and I call him Dolu, but I had an interesting literary problem. And the real names of my grandparents on my father's side are Adolf and Amalia. It wasn't a problem calling Amalia Lucia, because Lucia hated being called Amalia and called herself Lucia her whole life, and on her gravestone is Lucia. But my grandfather was actually Adolf. And I had a problem with Adolf for one reason is obvious: Hitler. Did I want to call him that? But I thought, no, it's his name. I should use it. Then I realised that in addition to the Hitler problem, also I couldn't call one of my grandfathers Alfred and the other Adolf, because people would get confused.
Yes.
So I called him Dolu throughout the book. But that is actually his diminutive rather than his name.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you chart the really what happens to that small group of friends of your mother, and her sisters. They set up almost a club with a newspaper, and it's very moving when we see what happens to those children. The other thing, of course, is the street in Amsterdam that Alfred and his family lived on. You chart what happens. You go through the houses number by number, and there's a devastating outcome for basically the whole.
While I was looking at what happened to all the children of the Joy and Glee Club, and as I said, I was able to find 19 of them, and you realise that everybody it either is imprisoned or killed in the group, except for the one non-Jewish person, and not all of them. But they still had, I think, a sort of something like a 75% survival rate. That is very high for Dutch Jews. And so I thought it'd be interesting to see how many people died in the road. And I thought, I'll never be able to find that out. And actually, I feel a bit of a fraud because everyone has said to me that is very powerful. It took me one click to find. It's on something called Ute Monument, and there it has all the houses and what happened to all the people. And I looked at it, and it immediately struck me. My goodness, almost every house, everyone and their next door neighbour. In every house in this road, so 90 people die in a short street. And I think it made the point, because it was in a Jewish part of Amsterdam, that made the point more eloquently, I think, than saying 6 million people died or 50,000 people died in Belsen. It was just very powerful.
And when Dolu and Lucia were living in Lviv, or Lvov, as it was, again, the book has these almost famous characters from history who come and go during it, these incredible coincidences that seem to be happening a lot. And Khrushchev moves in across the street, is that right? And your grandfather's wondering about whether he should be flying a Soviet flag or not.
Yeah, so he Khrushchev liked to be in the action when something was happening that he was in charge of. And as I tell the readers, he was the first secretary of the Communist Party. Felt the place he was, wreaking the most havoc at that moment was in Lvov. That was a sort of front line of the decision to take part of Poland into Soviet Ukraine. And so he moves into the house number 7, Herbertov Street, where previously owned by a man called Alexander Matsakati, who ends up in London, a publisher. He leaves the house vacant and Khrushchev moves into it. I found this out actually while researching a different thing, which is that after the war, because my grandparents can never go home, they close off Herbertov Street, and it's used as the communists use it for kind of holiday homes and visits. And I knew that Brezhnev had been there, and I was trying to pin down for sure that Brezhnev had been in number 12, which I wasn't able to do. But in the process, I was able to prove that he'd been on the street, which was plenty enough for the book. But I then discovered, my goodness, out of my father's window, you could see Khrushchev's house. One of the things, we all know Khrushchev for having been the person who moved away from Stalin. But one of the things he had to do was edit his recollections very carefully, because he was guilty of most of the offences that he accuses Stalin of. So that is a pretty important part. I was determined to kind of, on the Soviet side, to say who was responsible, and I hadn't really appreciated it was Khrushchev, but it was.
Mm. So as well as the men in the family, if you like, what really holds the book together is the role of the women and the mothers. Excuse my pronunciation, is it Greta or Greta?
Greta.
Greta
it's
was
Margareta, so it's Greta, yeah.
Right. So that was Alfred's wife. And throughout large parts of the book, certainly maybe the last half, the last 2/3, it's the story of Greta, keeping her 3 daughters alive. So that's Ruth, Eva, and Miriam, who was your mother. And they went through camps at Westerbork, they went to Belsen, and then finally got their freedom. Almost too late, but they got there. And whoever's read the excerpts in the Times will know about this crazy Paraguayan passport that came to be. Could you tell us a bit about the Paraguayan thing? Because I think that's out there in public
Well,
anyway,
let
isn't
me
it?
just say a quick word about Greta. One of the things in this book that gave me greater satisfaction was to tell Greta's story. She is all the time, like, she not only does she critical to keeping my mother and the children, the other children alive, she was also my grandfather's partner and helpmate, and doesn't really have the credit, even in the Wiener Library, that she should get. And indeed, in the official biography of my grandfather's life, her name's spelt with an H, which it was in the exhibition of the Wien Library. And only by going through all the papers, I actually said, I know that it's common to spell it with an H in Germany, but she wasn't with an H. So we weren't even spelling her name correctly as a family, right? My sisters, Tamara and Margaret Finkelstein, and we didn't know that she wasn't spelled Margaretha, but actually, and was actually known as Greta. I only found that out while doing it. So I got a lot of satisfaction out of that. The Paraguayan passports, that is an extraordinary story. So I'd always known that my mother had these Paraguayan passports. What I did not know was, where did they come from? And I happened to mention these in a tweet on the anniversary of my grandmother's death, and somebody said, "Oh, do those passports come from Switzerland?" And I was completely surprised. Who knows about these? Yes, they actually do come from Bern. That's the only thing it's almost the only thing I knew about them. And it turned out a group of Polish diplomats was studying their predecessors, and the Polish government in exile had a diplomatic outpost in Bern, and they knew about the Holocaust because the Polish government in exile obviously had agents in Poland where the worst action was taking place. So they began to look for ways to help Jews, and they found they could buy Paraguayan passports from the honorary consul, the Swiss solicitor called Rudolf Hugli. And Rudolf Hugli sold them these documents, stamped them, so they were completely legitimate in their issuing, but illegitimate in their origin. Everybody knows this. So everybody knows my mother's not Paraguayan, obviously my mother and her sisters, but also the Paraguayans, the Germans, the Americans, the British, everyone knows it. Yet they're still useful. The Germans were looking for somebody for some way of exchanging prisoners, and they needed people with an exchange value. And if they had a foreign passport from Paraguay, they had exchange value, even though they knew that the passports weren't legitimate, but it gave them that was useful to them. At first, the Americans are actually engaged in an exercise in trying to get the Paraguayans to disown these passports. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. They're so concerned about the integrity of the passport system and about asserting that they have no responsibility for people who aren't really Paraguayan, that they actually they positively lobbied the Paraguayans to cancel the passports. But just at the last minute, a man called Henry Morgenthau, who was very close to Roosevelt and Jewish, leans in and said, "Are you kidding? These passports are valuable. They could save these people's lives. We have to get the Paraguayans to recognize them." And America changed its policy. It's so late that almost nobody with these Paraguayan passports ends up in an exchange. But they do exchange 136 people out of all the millions of people who died and all the tens of thousands of people who died in Belsen. And my mother is one of the 136, a family of 4 of the 136, which is pretty extraordinary.
One of the things that comes across the Paraguayan passport being a good example is how these not little things, but how these perhaps slightly intangible things, potentially intangible, provided the hope that people needed to carry on while they were in the camps. So they would use whatever advantage they could possibly get to keep from being moved on to the death camps themselves. Yeah. Whether they knew someone that they thought might be useful if they gave their name, or they spoke a certain language, or they had relatives in other countries that they could try and say that these would take us.
So my book starts with a sentence: "Truth lies at the feet of liberty." And although there's clearly a metaphor in there, that it was also intended as a real statement. My grandfather had some First World War medals. They weren't spectacular ones, but they're solid ones. And my grandmother takes these medals into the camps, hoping that it will save their lives. And my mother always said, they were useless. Actually, I'm not sure they were. It's not possible to be sure at certain moments where they could have been sent to the gas chambers. They aren't. I think it was mainly because of their papers, but I do think actually proof of service did help. Even there, the reason why I said truthful lies at the feet of liberty is they then carry these with them at the end of the war. They're released onto this boat that goes to the United States, and they begin to worry that when they arrive in Ellis Island, they'll be interrogated as potential spies, which indeed they were, and which was a well-founded fear. They didn't know that, but it was a well-founded fear. And Ruth, the oldest of the girls, takes them all up into their cabin, wraps the medals in a handkerchief and drops it over the side. So the truth about my grandfather lies at the feet of the Statue of Liberty.
And perhaps there's an irony in the fact that after the war, the Germans ended up giving your grandfather a number of medals, didn't they, for the work he's done?
Well, so my grandfather got the West German equivalent of knighthood, the Federal Grand Cross, and he got given it on a personal recommendation of Adenauer on his 70th birthday. He never had the slightest question about accepting it, interestingly, even though some people felt he shouldn't. He's given it for two reasons. One, because he was, one of the leaders of the anti-fascist movement in Germany and had done this amazing work of the archive and helped British intelligence. And the other reason why he gets given it is because of the work he does after the war with young Germans, which was felt, the fact that he was willing to go back to Germany and give these speeches was felt to be incredibly generous, and the German leadership were very grateful to him for it.
But as you say in the book, your grandfather, to the end of his days, felt he was a German Jew. That was something he'd fought for all the way through his identity. It was just, that Germany and Jewishness were not two separate things, that you could easily have both together. And he never gave up on that identity, did he?
No, he didn't. He became British. But I discovered while I was doing it, fortunately, again, you ask about researching it. My grandfather had a lot of obituaries in the paper, and one of them said, his eulogy, he'd asked for his funeral to be in German, including the eulogy, German and Hebrew. And that was pretty striking to me. Right to the end, he asserted that German identity.
Also, I think one of the most dramatic stories, although they're all really dramatic, is that of Lucia and Ludwig, your father. Lucia is his mother. So Lucia and Ludwig, with Dolu having been removed and arrested and imprisoned, they end up being taken to Siberia by the Russians and put to work on a farm there, and living in the most extraordinary, depraved circumstances in terms of access to food and shelter and the weather. Could you tell us a bit about their story?
Yeah, so Lucia is one of my grandparents that I knew as Granny, and I always knew Granny was she was a very, very loving granny, amazing, very, very, very loyal and devoted to her grandchildren, particularly combative if anyone were to do anything against any of us, which I understood completely from knowing her story. And she fights for my father's life, really, in these extraordinary circumstances. When they're heading out there, she sees this terrible thing. This train stops at stations, and they basically take often children, and they just have to leave them by the side of the corpse, by the side of the railway, and go on without them. And my grandmother is determined this will not happen to her son. And they are in this, it's below freezing inside in their adobe hut, so it's sort of made out of the cow dung bricks they were making in the summer. But they have no fuel, so it's below freezing. Despite that, my grandmother spends the day teaching him the Iliad and the Odyssey, teaching him languages. An extraordinary person.
And then, as you said, you knew Lucia as Gran, so it's obvious she survived the war and moved to Hendon with her son and his wife, your mother, and sort of lived out her days just round the corner from you guys. I think sometimes when you look at these stories and places people end up, the extraordinary nature of what they went through, and then to end up in very sort of ordinary or everyday British circumstances, as we would see
So
it.
my gran used to go to. There's a picture of her in the book, which is very amusing, and it's her going shopping. Right, she's got these immaculate white gloves, a hat. She's dressed absolutely beautifully, and she used to go to Hendon Central to the Express Dairy shopping. Right, everybody knew her there. She would talk to everybody. She was this extraordinary figure, and of course, I realise now that I researched it, she was, one of the grand ladies of Lvov. Dolly was unbelievably wealthy. She would spend her days playing bridge, buying confectionaries from the confectionery shop to bring round to people's houses for coffee, going to the opera. That was her life, right? And she had a little bit of that bearing still, definitely. I didn't, you think, oh, okay, now I understand that a bit better than I did before. But it is incongruous, yeah. They live and the other thing that was, I know from the correspondence I've read actually after this book, which I did not know about, but I think the sisters, Eva and Ruth, were worried that my father's mother would be like a cuckoo in the nest. They'd have three of them. And you know what Princess Diana said about that, because my father had been so close to his grandmother. But somehow or other, that did not happen. My grandmother and my mother absolutely adored each other. And my grandmother just transferred all her loyalty that she had for my father. She just gave that to my mother as well, and to her grandchildren. And they had an absolutely wonderful relationship. And so my grandmother died in 1980, much loved by the family without the slightest bit of tension between them, which is an amazing achievement on her part and my mum's.
And one of the things that comes over is the extraordinary bond between Ludwig and Lucia. Obviously, given everything they'd been through, she'd kept him alive. But there's a beautiful letter, I think, in the book that he sent to her, where he talks about almost not being able to use words to communicate because the relationship goes beyond words. It's almost osmotic, or whatever it's. Yeah, quite something.
Quite something, and of course, you don't completely. So, what you think when you're a kid is, isn't that what everyone's like that? And in fact, I had a really funny thing. When I was talking to the publishers in the United States over Zoom about the book, my publisher said, show him some of, my agent rather said, show them some of the things that you've discovered with the book. And I, like the star, right? And I went through my head the thought, well, doesn't everyone have one of those? I was slightly impatient. And then I thought, don't be ridiculous. Of course they don't. So of course I showed it. And it's unfortunately don't have that with me now. It's at home, but if you read the book, it's there's a very good photograph of it in the book. So it's been, by the way, just the opportunity to do that, to take a picture of that star, put it in a book, and have that there forever. To have a collection of this whole story for my children and for whatever grandchildren and generations of this family is an immensely satisfying thing. And I did feel that it was my responsibility in the family. My brother and sister got other things to do, to be the one that really, got our story down, to have had an opportunity to do that and not have to self-publish it. Then of course, for it to get these reviews and a bestseller and all that has been, well, that's just amazing.
No, it's incredible and well deserved. One of the other things I like about the book is it never flags, because there are always people popping in with incredible stories who are in it for a bit and then might not be in it for very much longer. And one of them would be your great-grand Charlotte, who was rounded up and was on the cusp of being carted away to the east, or however they would put it.
Tell everyone, but during when I was watching the video of her story, I'm just trying to think how I can tell this without telling it. But I didn't understand. I'd always had an anecdote about how she does what she does, and I'd not really understood it. And then I realized, oh, it was bribery. That's what she did, right? I didn't understand that before. So each of these characters comes into it. So one of the things I try to do is never to visit a historical event without being accompanied by a member of the family or a friend.
Yes.
In the Katyn massacre, it was very important that we follow Ignacy Shraga, Aldona. I knew Aldona very well when I was a kid, and Marion, I still know his granddaughter, and to tell the story about Ignazi when I'm telling the Katyn massacre, and not just to tell the story of the Katyn massacre itself, but to tell it through people.
Yes, yes. Another extraordinary woman is Betty from Nottingham. Do you want to tell us a bit about her, whatever you can?
So I won't want to tell you the whole story, but I do. Betty was. I knew Betty when I was growing up. She was a state-registered mental nurse who lived in Nottingham with her sister Kathy. If you look up Betty online, you'll find absolutely nothing, right? And I just had these fragments of a story from my mother about how they knew Betty. And I then discovered she told her whole story to my grandfather, and it was in the Wien Library. So just this person at the last moment, really, I suddenly was able to bring this person to life and to understand why she was able to do what she was able to do. And she was my mother's home help when she was young. So I knew her as Betty from Nottingham, but she was actually Betty from Berlin and then Betty from Amsterdam. But she had another identity, and you can read all about that.
Yeah, it's one of the most incredible stories in the book. And I suppose we should mention Anne Frank, who is perhaps one of the most famous victims of the Nazis, and she again is part of your story.
Yeah, so I always thought my mother was Dutch, and everyone probably thinks of Anne Frank as being a Dutch child. But Anne Frank, like my mum, was German, or at least my mother was born in Germany. My sister Ruth was 6 when she left Germany. My grandfather, they were still German during this period, but my mother lived in Holland. And another person who'd come from Germany was part of the German refugee community in Holland was Anne Frank. And Anne and Margot were part of the same synagogue, the Liberale Jüdische Gemeinde in Amsterdam. They also went to Montessori schools. You can see the famous picture of Anne with her pen over the desk with that sort of little grate behind her. You can see exactly the same picture of my mother, clearly taken in the same style by the same person. And my aunt, so the ages are Anne was 94, as it were, on the 12th of June, and my mother was 90, as it were, on the 10th of June. So there was a gap of age. And my mother looked up to Anne. My aunt Ruth looked down on her. And what the person that she looked up to was Margot. Everyone looked up to Margot. And if you then read the diaries again, knowing that, Margot was quite a character. Anne had this unbelievable electricity, and you can read that from her book. But Margot was, quite a loss as a person. She really was, brilliant. And if you think about the greatness of Otto Frank as a person, I think Margot had some of that and some seriousness as well. We might have lost somebody who would have been, somebody that we'd all known for completely different reasons.
And they came across the Franks in the camp again, didn't they?
So my aunt has a little diary. She took that diary. So again, who else has that? It's amazing. She took this Let's type diary, a little pocket diary. She wins it in a competition. She hasn't filled it in. She takes it with them when they're arrested. They're halfway through the year at that point. But she starts a diary in Westerbork and keeps, one thing, I was only the other day coming across it. So one of the first entries says, Aunt Elsa and Yulcha, in brackets, a school friend, are sent on the transport. This means they've been sent to Sobibor or Auschwitz. And Yulcha actually was a friend of Anne Frank's. She's in the picture of Anne Frank's 10th birthday, standing with her and her other friends. So there's lots of things, but one of those entries is Anne and Margot Frank in the next door camp, which she wrote down because she knew them, not obviously because she thought they had any more significance. But my mother actually did remember seeing them because Ruth was quite excited to see someone she knew. Yeah.
I'm interested in, those of us who are not Jewish obviously don't have this background. How common is, your family might have particular, success on one side and, a great scholar on the other, but amongst the Jewish families that in Britain, is the experience relatively common amongst those
everyone.
families?
So there are two things. First of all, it's not universal, because there are some people who've been here for centuries, and some people who've been here. The very common thing is the Russians drove them out. Right? If you want to understand why my grandfather fought in the First World War, he was on the other side to the Russians. Right? The Russian pogroms that they didn't think could happen in Germany drove out a lot of people. So those people, that's quite a common thing to have been here since the turn of the century. But when people do have a Holocaust story, which is obviously common, no, not universal, it always is extraordinary, because nobody who doesn't have an extraordinary story survived. Right? You had to have extraordinary luck, and almost nobody who didn't have amazing tale to tell survives at all.
Yeah. Well, one of your, I think, key purposes in writing this book, beyond the family story, is it comes across anyway that you're very keen to illuminate the Soviet barbarity as much as the Nazi one, and you make the point, I guess, that Stalin's crimes have always been somehow treated as lesser than Hitler's. And there's a passage in your book I'll just read here. You say the public interest in Stalin's crimes didn't come. Your mum would go around schools talking about her experience in the German camps, but nobody invited Dad to tell his story in schools. Nobody spoke of the Katyn murders. Hardly anyone knows of the Polish deportations. If anyone even now points to similarities between communism and fascism, it's regarded as a rather crude thing to do. When the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials was celebrated in 2020 as the birth of international justice, it wasn't much commented upon that every crime the tribunal had determined that the Nazis were guilty of, the Soviets were guilty of too. And you also, of course, given we're talking about Lviv, in terms of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, you draw a line to Vladimir Putin and his behaviour now. Can you tell us a bit about that Soviet behaviour and why you think it hasn't been treated with the same weight as the Nazis?
So the first thing that happens when I do this book, the first file I take out, I open the file. I've kept it since I was like 11. It says Alfred Wiener alive in it, and I've kept, the New York Times obituary of my dad and my grandfather. I was obviously very proud of it. The first thing I pull out of it, I can't remember ever having seen before, but it's an electric document. It is my grandfather's own copy of the indictment of the Nuremberg defendants. Right, and I'm sort of astonished at this document, which is now in the Wiener Library again, where it belongs. But I read the document and think the Soviets committed all of those crimes, and that's the origin of that observation in the book. And the reason they didn't, I think there are two things involved in it. The first is a very crude one. They won the war with the Allies, so they didn't want Nuremberg to be victor's justice, but it was inevitably, to some extent, victor's justice. It tried very hard to give it, a feel of international law, and Philippe Sands writes so brilliantly about that. But it also definitely had an element of, we won the war, and then the Russians helped to try people, often, for example, putting them on trial for the Katyn massacre, which they committed themselves. Right? They didn't find them guilty of that, to be fair, but they did try. So I think that one reason was just that they won the war. The second, and this is a subtler one, is there was something unique about the Nazi use of the gas chambers, which the Soviets didn't do. And here comes my mother's phrase, which I think is so vital. It's not a competition, right? The fact that the Nazis used the gas chambers does not reduce the horror of what the Soviets did to my father. It's not a competition. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't, in my view, reduce even an iota the evil of what they did. But it just is different. So I think that undoubtedly, because there is something extraordinary about the decision to industrially kill people as if they were animals, as if they were, just rodents or something. That is an extraordinary thing to have done. Nevertheless, as a result of it, the fact that the Soviets had almost as surely killed people or starved people or transported people to their deaths and actually had these camps with, effectively Arbeit macht free, that work would set you free. That was what the Gulag was.
Yeah, yeah. The you also, in relation to that, you mentioned the Nazi-Soviet pact and the addendum to the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement, in which the Soviets kind of committed to, although secretly and tried very hard to hide it, committed to this kind of behaviour in print, signing a deal with the Nazis on it.
Yeah, I describe that as the most important political event in the life of my parents. And was like more important than the Brexit referendum. And I make that as a joke simply because obviously we get ourselves very. That happened right at the end of my mother's life, the Brexit referendum. But we have a sort of inclination to think these political events are very important, and they're dwarfed by this. But they basically come to an agreement that divides up Poland between the Nazis and the Soviets. Even quite late in his life, I remember my father telling the story and telling me that the city council of Lviv had decided to surrender to the Russians because they had so many Jews in the city. And actually, unusually for my dad, who was very accurate about such things, that wasn't true. I don't think the Jews thing really came into it. And in any case, the reason they ended up surrendering to the Soviets is because the Nazis withdrew because they had a pact.
Yeah.
So even now, people who were involved in it don't know that's why they controlled Soviet Ukraine, because they had a deal with the Nazis.
Yeah. Another thing that comes out of the book is perhaps, or who doesn't come well out of the book, are the Allies in certain cases, in particular how they dealt with Jewish refugees. I remember being in Israel some years ago now and sort of sticking up a bit for Britain and its treatment of Jews. This was pre-Corbyn, and then effectively getting shouted at and quite publicly humiliated by an academic who knew considerably more about the subject than I did. But could you maybe explain a bit about that, about where the British and Americans, well, the British probably come out worse, actually, I think.
For you in this argument, and use my mother in this. So you cannot read this without thinking, okay, at moments the Allies showed an almost unbelievable lack of imagination, right? And here they were trying their best to cancel these passports for bootling reasons, or believing their own planted rumours that the Nazis had created a school where they were giving their spies plastic surgery to look more Jewish, and then they were going to infiltrate them through concentration camp exchanges. I mean, extraordinary theories. And you read that and you think how terrible it is. But there are lots of stories in the book of similar types of lack of imagination from Jews, from external critics, and from the governing authorities. And my mother would have had the same response to all of them, and she would have been at your side saying the Nazis were to blame. Right. In the end, the British made a lot of mistakes, but if the British had not done what they did, and if those young, brave people had not come and, mostly some of them ruined their lives by what they had to see at Belsen, someone like Marla Tribbicham I saw the night before last wouldn't be alive. And it was an extraordinary thing that they did. And Mum wouldn't want to diminish that. Her feeling was, the Nazis were to blame. Let's not blame the victims for the decisions they make. So there's a moment in the book, which you'll be aware of, where a man called Kurt Zelenziger, who worked for my grandfather, who doesn't want the library to close in Amsterdam, has failed, almost certainly this is true, he'd failed to give, his family still dispute this, but I think it was almost certainly correct. He failed to hand out the visas that my grandfather had helped obtain for the staff. He and various other members of staff die in the Holocaust, not having used these visas, which he had on his desk. That was obviously a mistake, and it was caused by his own stubbornness and his own passive-aggressive defiance of common sense, but it wasn't his fault.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. He did make a mistake, but the fault belonged to the Nazis. Let's not blame the victims. That would have been Mum's view.
Yeah. Just again, if anyone has any questions, there's one come in which I'll come to in a sec. But if anyone has, now's a good time to send them through. Just getting to the end of my points, I did feel that I understood you and how you write and why you write and what you write better after reading this book. You know, the values and the judgments and the perspectives that sort of shine through consistently in your column over the years. And there are sort of two passages that I think connect quite well. So you say towards the end that politics matters, and our politics, I think you mean the politics of your family, is the one we inherited from Miriam and Ludwig, for protecting civil rights under the law, defending liberal norms, supporting a Jewish state while integrating into the country that had taken us in, for moderation against extremism, for reason over irrationality, for optimism, resilience tempered by the memory of dictatorship and oppression, but never overwhelmed by it, and for the quiet institutions of a stable society and a peaceful state. As my grandmother Lucia used to say, while the Queen's safe in Buckingham Palace, we are safe in Hendon Central. And that ties a bit into the speech you gave at your 50th birthday back in 2012, where you talk about we live here in peace and don't stay up at night fearing we'll be woken by a knock on the door. We don't fear arrest or exile. Here's to the Sunrise Cafe in North Harrow and the tube station in Brent Cross Shopping Centre. But then you say, I don't think if I was having this birthday party now that I'd make the same speech. And is that a reference to maybe what the Labour Party went through and that seeming rise of anti?
It's not. No, it's a little bit Labour. It's a little bit Trump. It's certainly a little bit Boris Johnson. One of the reasons I feel so passionately about issues like lying to Parliament or proroguing the Supreme Court or asserting that because we've had a referendum, Parliament mustn't be Parliament or the courts mustn't be an enemy of the people, is because those are the institutions that stand between us and barbarism, and we have to stand up for them. And if we don't, the costs are very clear, and that's definitely. So I think that from there are three bits of my politics that that this book influences. The biggest by far is that support for a liberal democracy and a conservative temperament. I'm just nervous about big radical sweeping changes. I hate ideology about the country is totally broken. Well, as my mum would say when I used to say I was hungry, and she used to say, you don't know what hungry is. People don't know what broken is, right? The ASLEF going on strike is like not broke, it's not broken, right? That's a completely different. The broken is what happened to my parents. That's broken. I'm not saying that we should be complacent about what we've got and not be progressive about reforming it and changing it and impatient and have political debates about it and sometimes be caustic and scathing. I'm not saying that, but I do think we need to be very careful about the language we employ and the sentiments that we use. So the first thing is it leads me to that kind of moderate sensibility. The second thing is obviously it does reach a certain position on refugees. This country cannot have an open migration policy, but we do have the international system for refugees is creaking at the edges under the pressure of all the people who want to do it, and we need to have some kind of international accords that allow us to deal with that properly, and we need to play our part as a country in that. I found I couldn't vote for the illegal migration bill when it was in the House of Lords at all. And then the third thing, which is much less usual, my grandfather didn't want to be a refugee, neither did my mum. Neither of my grandparents did. Nobody wants to be a refugee. My mum and dad were happy in the countries they were brought up in. My dad wanted, my grandfathers wanted to be Poles or Germans, but they didn't want to be a refugee. So it's also led me to have quite a lot of sympathy for trying to help resistance movements who want to end the oppressive anti-human rights behaviour. And just like people don't seem to mind kind of having quite unrealistic views about how many migrants we might be able to take, yet they don't want an unrealistic view about how much we can do to save the world. They sometimes say we mustn't be the world's policeman, and you think, well, a world without policemen, that's not a very good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Very powerfully said. But just take a couple of questions before we finish. Now, there's someone who's mysteriously only known as 747797. Do you want to ask your question? I presume it's someone I know. I can read it out for you if you don't. But do you want to come on camera and ask? Ah. Okay, I'll ask it, and please interrupt if you. It says, heartfelt thanks for writing the most inspiring family history I've ever read. In these troubled times, it's vital to see the incredible courage of your relations. Has writing the book and the reaction to it had any influence on your plans for your future commitments? Book tour, presumably.
Sorry?
A book tour, at least.
Yeah, well, I'm also doing that, but I think, I remember seeing my mum right at the end of her life. She gave a speech at my son's school, and she'd done all these school talks, and she'd, been to 10 Downing Street and given her talk. And I realised, and I was right. I thought, I think this is the last one you're going to do, Mum, isn't it? And I now know I've got to tell the story, and I'm going to tell my mum's story and my dad's. I'm obviously doing it in this book, but there are lots of charities like the Holocaust Education Trust and the Wiener Library. And as you can imagine, because of what I do, lots of charities, they want me to be part of, their board of trustees, and it's led me to try to think I will prioritize those ones who are about community security. So I've just agreed to be involved in Gerald Ronson's efforts there, and about the broader issue of knowledge of the Holocaust and of the anti-liberal movements of the mid 20th century, because you can't do everything, and that seems to me to be something where I could make an impact. So it has had influence on my diary.
Yeah. Okay. And Catherine Miles. Catherine.
Yeah, hi Danny, fantastic book. And your grandmothers particularly just stand out. So I'm interested, what do you think all four of your grandparents would make of you writing it and make of the book?
So I've said of my parents that my parents would have been, people have said, oh, your parents would have been so proud of this book. And they definitely would have been. I know what they were like. But they'd also been very proud of me not writing it, or if I'd written it badly, because that's the sort of people they were. My grandmother, Lusha, would have she would have really liked me being in the House of Lords, without any question, but she would have thought that there was no question whatsoever that would happen. Mm-hmm. Obviously it did. That would be her way of looking at the world. I think I'm pretty sure that Dolu and Alfred would have really wanted the story to be told, I hope that Greta would feel that it was worth including her correspondence. So one of the issues in it, there's a letter that Greta wrote to Ruth on her 16th birthday. In my own view, part of the heart of the book, having that letter, it's incredible. My cousin Michael found that in Ruth's drawer by her bed when she dies. And it's in an envelope marked private. So Michael wondered, and so did I, about including it. But in the end, we all thought she would have wanted it. And I just hope we made the right decision.
Well, certainly from a reader's perspective, you did, Danny. It's as you say, it's at the heart of the book. There's a few letters in there which are incredibly affecting, and I think really get the character of your family across. Well, I think that wraps things up quite nicely. It's a book that honestly I could talk about for some considerable time, and for those of you that haven't read it, let me just say again, hopefully this has shown that you should read it, this conversation, but it's an extraordinary read. It's a big book, but it's actually quite a quick read because you don't want to put it down and you just keep turning the pages and sort of gasping with every new revelation, and as I said, it's it has moments of great entertainment, but just moments that are absolutely shattering, and I was saying to Danny before we came on that I could actually see it being made into some kind of drama or movie because it's just full of these moments of high drama. So Danny, thank you so much for giving us an hour today. There's no point wishing you great success with the book because it's already successful and will clearly go on to be successful. I can hear the words Baillie Gifford Prize in my head. I know Jason Cowley was the chair of the judges for the Baillie Gifford Winner of Winners, so I'll maybe have a word on his shell. I can see if I can push him towards you in that. But thanks again, and thank you to everyone for coming along today. Just a tremendous conversation and a tremendous book. So
thank you very much for having me. And I now know who you are, 747. Judith McClure.
Judith McClure.